All right, I think this is it. Are we live? Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Of course, Marc's video camera stopped working exactly at the moment we tried to start. So hopefully we got all the Murphy factor out of the way and the rest of this will go smoothly. You want to say hello, Marc?
I think I can do that.
I see some people.
I have to say, since our last conference, I think my emotional intelligence and social skills have diminished by about 20 points. But good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're coming in from. We are super excited for today, and just delighted that we were able to host a second conference after our inaugural one last year. And back to you, Matt.
Thanks. Yeah, I see people in the chat chiming in on where they are, which is always fun. So please jump in. Nigeria, Germany, Santa Cruz, Cambridge, London. Nice global representation. Super fun.
Australia, Costa Rica.
Glad to see everyone here from all over, and keep the conversation going. It's as a speaker in these things, it's always you're kind of two minds. You're delighted to see people talking. At the same point, you're up there listening to some of the stuff happening in the session, but absolutely take advantage of the community, so to speak. Introductions. I'm Matt Kirsch. I'm a co-founder and CEO of OG Life Lab. We organized this conference, and most of you know Marc already. I'm going to just make some introductory comments, and then we're going to get started with Marc and our first speaker, Niobe Way. Some of you were with us for our first conference a year ago, a little more than a year ago. We did it kind of in the shadow of the beginning of COVID, 3 or 4 months after COVID started. And I think we felt like we were in a difficult time that hopefully was going to be over soon, and that we should all get together and try to use emotional intelligence to help us boost our coping skills. And here we are 16 months after that conference, and we're still in COVID. And a lot of us find ourselves wondering, like, how in the world is this still going on? Kind of everything's changed. A lot of us haven't seen our offices. A lot of us haven't seen, family members, haven't traveled. Things are changing and going to keep changing. And that's why the theme of our conference is embracing change. Change is going to keep on occurring, and we have to be ready. And of course, there's change on the outside in the world at large, and then the change we want to make inside of ourselves. And a lot of what we'll talk about over the next few days will be about that personal change. Hopefully will help us cope with the external change. You're going to see a lot of different kinds of topics in the conference this year. Fascinating conversations in the area of emotional intelligence. A big new theme you'll see is decision making, which is something we at OG Life Lab are working more at. Obviously, there are a lot of decisions to be made in this new world. And, we always talk about the 5 benefits of emotional intelligence. And one of the key ones is it helps you with decision making. And we're tackling that in a very proactive way now. You're going to see some great speakers. Niobe Way's up next with Marc. We have folks from major universities. My friend Sean Kelly, the philosopher from Harvard, will be joining us later today. We have partners at Johnson & Johnson and Amazon that are coming on to talk about their work in emotional intelligence. Marc and our other co-founder, Robin Stern, are very much threaded throughout the whole program. And then Kenneth Cole will be having a conversation with Marc tomorrow afternoon about mental health, which I'm sure is going to be fantastic. So, I view each one of these sessions as a kind of doorway that you can walk through to explore some new territory. It's really just a first visit. None of us are going to become masters of any of these topics in this one session, but hopefully it'll be exciting discoveries for each of you. So that's a little bit overview of what's going to happen today and tomorrow. In terms of some just practical stuff, if you're having technical problems, you can go to the OG Life Lab website and chat with us, and we'll do our best to help you. You can also email us at info@oglifelab.com. So if you have problems, don't hesitate to let us know. This platform we're using called AirMeet is pretty groovy. You'll see it. It kind of emulates a conference feel, so you can go in and out of sessions. We have booths that are occurring where we're talking about our products. We also have kind of a chat area that's called a lounge where you can meet people. But you'll see, like, when this session ends, you go out of this session and then you go into other sessions. And there are times when there are multiple sessions happening at the same time, 2 tracks. The cool thing is that unlike a real conference, you can go to one track and then you can watch the other one later. So you have that flexibility. A lot of you have discovered the chat already. Keep enjoying it. You'll also see there's a Q&A tab up top next to the chat where if you have questions, you can add them. And our speakers and moderators will take advantage of that when they get to a Q&A session. So that's how to use AirMeet. There is this lounge several times during the day. If you exit the session, you can go into the lounge, and there's themed tables on different topics, and you can go meet and greet new people. Some folks find that horrifying, and they would never want to get mixed up with a stranger on video chat. We hope that some of you will find it appealing to get to chat with people about emotional intelligence or decision-making or other topics that we have going on. So you can take advantage of that. There are also 2 booths open, one on our emotional intelligence training program called OG Emotions. So you can visit that if you want to know more about OG Emotions. And then another booth on OG Decide, which is our new decision-making program. So you can go learn there. And finally, I'm happy to say that everybody who attends, who signed up for our conference, will be getting admission to OG Decide, our new decision-making program. So that's normally a $349 program. If you've been in OG Emotions, you have already the feel of the thing. It's a 60-step program where you really learn the details and specifics about how to make better decisions. We have great coverage of cognitive bias and how to combat it. We have Marc talking about emotional intelligence and how it can help you make better decisions. So everybody in this program will get admitted into OG Decide. That will come out right after New Year's. We would give it to you before New Year's, but we know that everybody will miss it in their email and they'll never notice that it got it. So we're just going to be realistic and give it to you right after New Year's. And hopefully it'll help you make some great decisions in 2022. So everybody's going to get it in OG Decide. We also, as part of the conference, are offering $50 off OG Emotions, the program we've been offering for years. And we're going to email you the details on how you can get $50 off. It is limited. It lasts for about a week, and it's for a single unit of OG Emotions. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. So that's it for my introductions. Thank you all very much for being here. It's super exciting watching all the comments come in, and I'm going to get off the screen and let Marc and Niobe do their thing. Thanks, Marc.
Thank you, Matt. See you soon. All right, so welcome back, everyone. And well, we didn't go anywhere, but welcome to the next session. Niobe, would you join me on the screen, please, so I can praise you while you're staring, while we're staring at each other? So for the next 50 or so minutes, you're going to get to hear from a close friend and a brilliant scholar from NYU. Her name is Niobe Wei, and she's right there next to me. Niobe is a professor of applied developmental psychology. That's correct, at NYU. She is a co-founder of something that's super important called the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity. And she is the leader of another important project that's called the Listening Project. She's written a book that's co-edited with many other important scholars on the crisis of connection. And what we asked Niobe to talk about today is exactly that. I was thinking about it as we were opening the conference, Niobe, around how disconnected we are as a society right now. And so my hope is that you're going to help us find ways to connect better. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to bring up your slides, let you speak and teach people all your knowledge and your experience, and then we'll come back and do some conversation together. Sound good?
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Mark. Yeah, it sounds fantastic. First of all, thank you, Mark. I'm really excited to be here. This is a kind of event I love doing, and I love doing it with my good friend, Mark. Mark, can you hear me okay? Is my sound okay?
You're perfect.
Okay, good.
And there's your slides.
Okay, good. Wonderful. So, okay, good. So Mark's gonna be my slide person in this presentation. So thank you, Mark, for doing that. I want to start off with first just sort of reinforcing what Mark just said, which is that we are facing a crisis of connection at this moment in our time, in our global world. I'll talk about what that is and why I know that, where that data comes from. I'm going to talk about sort of stepping back, looking at the trees looking at the forest before we look at the trees metaphorically, which is trying to understand why are we in a crisis of connection? What are the roots of this crisis? What is the crisis actually? What do I mean by the crisis of connection? And then the consequences of it, which is dire. The consequences of our crisis are quite dire. It includes suicide and all forms of violence. And then, of course, the solutions. And Mark, I'm hoping in our discussion afterwards, we can really do a deep dive in terms of thinking about the solutions, because I'm going to be mostly focusing on understanding the nature of the change that we need to do. I love that I'm in a conference on embracing change, because it's really, my talk is really all about the kind of change we need to embrace as we move forward to address this crisis we're in. Okay, so Mark, you can, you know what, Mark, I think, yes, good, perfect. Okay, so this is the book that Mark was referring to. You can check it out. It's on Amazon. It's an edited book, and it talks about what the crisis, but the most important thing in this book that I think might be interesting for many of you is that it has a lot of researchers and practitioners in this book who talk about the ways in their own practice, in the workplace, in schools, in homes, that they're addressing the crisis of connection. So it's a very practical edited book that I encourage you to check out. I think it'd be quite interesting. Okay, next slide, please. The work I'm presenting today is from, so I'm a developmental psychologist, as Mark already explained. I've been focused on social emotional development since the late 80s. That's been my focus. I've been at NYU since 1995 and been listening to young people, particularly the ages of 11 to 18, for almost over 30 years at this point. And what you hear when you start to listen to young people and hear how their social emotional themes change over time, you start to hear a story about what it means to be human and being raised in the culture that we're in, modern culture, which I'll talk about what I mean by that. But what you learn is you learn a story, and in fact, it's a 5-part story I'm going to teach you today. The story that listening to young people has communicated to us. And then I'm going to also show you that story that we learn from young people is the exact same story we learned from the larger body of science over the past century. So there's something beautiful about you hear the same story in listening to young people in my studies as you do in the larger story told in the sciences over the past century about who we are as human, what we need most, which is connection with each other, and then how that our culture gets in the way of helping us form connections, the consequences of that, what I'm calling the crisis of connection, and then the solutions. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the findings from this book on boys' friendships. And what I want you to do is, this will sound, depending on what workplace you have, this may not sound like it's relevant to you. You're not an adolescent. You may not be a boy or a man. But the idea is that we're learning from adolescent boys in this part of the talk about what it means to be human. And so these are the 3 themes I've heard over about 30 years of doing research. And my research, by the way, is mixed method. It's both survey data as well as interview data. And I'm relying exclusively on the interview data. and drawing from really at this point thousands of boys I've interviewed throughout adolescence. So as a developmental psychologist, I study the same kids over time. So 11 years old, I follow them, excuse me, all the way until they're 18 years old, looking at the way they change through adolescence. And they tell us a story about what it means to be human and what gets in the way of our humanity. So there's 3 themes that adolescent boys share, and I'm going to summarize them here, and then you're going to hear a couple quotes from them so that you can really feel their emotion and feel their passion when they talk. I learn about how to do that publicly with Marc all the time. And so the 3 themes that boys communicate, and if you listen to them throughout adolescence, is the importance of, they want deep secret friendships, male friendships in particular. There's a huge theme in my work of young men and boys deeply, deeply wanting emotionally intimate friendships with other boys and girls as well, but their focus is on other boys. They link friendships explicitly to mental health. This is not sort of a finding I had in my research. Boys say it directly, the essential nature of friendships for their own mental health. And then there's an experience, which you'll hear in the quotes, the loss of friendships from early to late adolescence as the pressures to man up intensify for boys. So as the expectations of masculinity come into the cultural pressure to man up, they start to disconnect from the very friendships that were critical to their mental health. And the consequence for some boys, as we know in the popular press, which is all sorts of violence, when they're forced to disconnect from the very thing that they want for their mental health. So let's listen to boys for another couple minutes. And then once we listen to these boys, I'll then branch it out larger to the larger body of research, and then we'll go into solutions. Okay, Marc, you can go to the next one. I'll go through this fairly quickly, but I want you to listen to the boys and listen to what they're teaching us. So in my studies, when you ask boys about, tell me about your friendships, this is what 13, 14-year-old boys sound like. And again, I want to underscore that these are about, drawing from samples of, at this point, over thousands of boys around the world, actually, not just in the United States, but in China as well. So when you ask them about friendships, they say things like, Justin says, my best friend and I love each other, that's it. You have this thing that is deep, so deep it's within you, you can't explain it. It's just a thing that you know that person is that person, and that is all that should be important in our friendship. I guess in life, sometimes 2 people can really, really understand each other and really have a trust, respect, and love for each other. It just happens. It's human nature. That's Justin. Next slide, please. Carlos says, when asked about his friends, he says, I've got 2 best friends, Willie and Brian. Like sometimes when me and Willie argue, me and Brian are real close. Then when me and Brian are not doing so good, me and Willie are real close. It's like circles of love. Sometimes we're all close. And I want to emphasize here that these themes are particularly evident in early to middle adolescence, which is approximately the ages of 11, 12, all the way up to about 15. These are what boys sound like in before the age of about 15. This is what boys sound like from around the world, these kinds of emotional content. The word love coming up a lot when they describe either what they want in their friendships or what they have in their friendships. Okay, next slide. Another boy says, my best friend could just tell me anything and I could tell him anything, like I always know everything about him. We always chill, like we don't hide secrets from each other. We tell each other our problems. Another boy said, if I'm having problems at home, they'll like counsel me. I just trust them with anything, like deep secrets, anything. And what I want to point out, especially to everyone who's so committed to emotional intelligence, is just showing the emotional intelligence of boys. That, a remarkable emotional intelligence about the need to share emotional content to be able to get things out. And I just think this is that was sort of surprised me, given our stereotypes about boys not being emotionally intelligent. Their emotional intelligence is outstanding. So next slide, Marc. It's like a bond. We keep secrets. Like if there's something that's important to me, like I could tell him and he won't go and make fun of it. Like if my family is having problems or something. Next slide. And the final one that I'm going to read, and then we're going to go to the next theme, is a boy says, yeah, because my best friend is like a second person you could speak to. It's like, see how the kids carry a little teddy bear or whatever, And when they'll cry, they'll hold it and stuff. So when like you get upset or something, you just walk over to your closest friends and they'll loosen you up, whatever. They'll be like, yeah, it's all right, even though it's not. And here, this is beautiful because what this boy is articulating, which is part of his emotional intelligence, is that he understands that sometimes you say you're all right, even though you're not all right. And so that kind of faking emotion, as teenagers call it, boys recognize when they fake with each other. And so I think it's fascinating that this quote from me, and he makes that explicit. Okay, next slide, Mark. Okay, so the second thing was about the specific link between the need for friendships and emotional intimacy specifically. So I'm not just saying friendships in terms of, you know, the sort of stereotypic bromance where you need your bros. I'm talking about specifically friendships. What they're asking for is friendships in which they have deep emotional connection, emotional intimacy around the ways they feel in their heart. Those are the kinds of friendships they're seeking. So every time we stereotype boys and say that somehow they just want this sort of superficial buddy talk, that's not reflecting what boys have told me over the past 30 years. So here, let me give you an example. So for mental health, when I ask, why do you need friends? This is a question, why do you need friends? This is a young man says, you need friends to talk to sometimes, you know, like you have nobody to talk to. You don't have a friend, it's hard. You got to keep things bottled up inside. You might just start crying or whatever. Like if a family member is beating on you or something and you can't tell a friend, you might just go out, just, you know, do drugs, sell drugs, whatever. And so the whole thing is that mental health is key to being able to work things out that are in which you're suffering in life. So next slide. Okay, oops, go back, Mark. Yeah, go back. One more. Okay, sometimes when asked about why you need friendships, oops, forward. Okay, good. When asked about why you need friendships, he says someone to talk to, like you have problems with something, you go talk to him. And I want to underscore, you go talk to him. You know, if you keep it all to yourself, you go crazy, try to take it out on somebody else. Another boy says, without friends, you'd go crazy or mad. You'd be lonely all the time, be depressed. You'd go wacko. Another kid says, my friendships are important because you need a friend, or else you'd be depressed. You won't be happy. You'd try to kill yourself because then you'd be all alone and no one to talk to. And this explicit link between friendships, emotionally intimate friendships, and basically wanting, you know, if you don't have it, you'd be depressed, you won't be happy, you'd try to kill yourself. I've heard this theme over this link with mental health. Over 80% of the boys in my studies will reveal something like this when you ask about the importance of friendships. Next slide, please. Okay, Lee says, if you don't have friends, no, you got no one to talk to. The interview says, so what happens then? Lee says, then it's like you need to keep all the secrets to yourself. What do you think it'd be like if you didn't have someone? Then it's like I always like think bad stuff in my brain because like no one's helping me and I just need to keep all the secrets to myself. Next slide, final slide. Okay, what you find is the third and final theme in the boys' work has to do with loss. And this is when you, as boys reach mid-adolescence to late adolescence, which is about ages 15, 16, 17, you start to hear a shift in their language. As the pressures to man up and the link between close male friendships and sexuality get made more explicitly. So in the late 20th century, we've created male friendships to be something that's especially emotionally intimate male friendships as somehow indicative of sexuality, even though we know from centuries of research that wanting close friendships is actually just a human thing. It's not linked to a gender or sexuality, but we've sexualized that. And so boys, as they get older, they hear that message in terms of the norms of masculinity, and you hear it in the way they talk about friendships. So by the time they're 15 or 16, their story shifts. So this is how the same kids that you heard earlier, these are the same boys now at 15 and 16. This is what they say when you ask them about their friendships. I asked the question, how have your friendships changed since you were a freshman in high school and they're now seniors? I don't know, maybe not a lot, but I guess that best friends become close friends. So that's basically the thing that's changed. It's like best friends become close friends become general friends, and then general friends become acquaintances. So they just, if there's a distance, whether it's, I don't know, natural or whatever, you can say that, but it just happens that way. And what's interesting about this quote is that it's the same kid at the beginning, Justin, that I quoted initially, that talks about the connection being human nature. And now he's making the loss natural. And what's interesting that boys recognize is actually what is in fact cultural, meaning the loss is about the norms of masculinity that pressure boys to disconnect from their desire for intimacy with other boys. Boys actually make into what is must be natural if it's happening to them. So we make what is cultural into nature, and we get into trouble when we do that. Okay, next slide. Second, when asked, boy, how have your friendships changed since you were younger? We used to be close as far as always being around each other. Now it's just we're apart, like as far as if I need them, they'll still be there. If they need me, I'll still be there. But as far as like always being together, we're not as close as we were before. Go ahead. Next one. Okay, and then finally, the last quote you'll see for today. This is one child that said, do you have a closer best friend this year? He's now a senior. He says, not really. I think myself, the friend I had, I lost it. That was the only person that I could trust. And we talked about everything when I was down. He used to help me feel better, the same I did for him. So I feel pretty lonely and sometimes depressed because I don't have no one to go out with, no one to speak on the phone with, to tell my secrets or to help me solve my problems. Why don't you think you have someone? Because I think that it will never be the same. You know, I think that when you have a real friend and you lost it, I don't think you find another one like him. That's the point of view I have. I tried to look for a person, you know, but it's not that easy. And this quote is very powerful because he talks about the loss. What you don't hear in these quotes, because it's sort of in all the interviews that you hear throughout, but you don't hear it in one particular quote, is the repetition of no homo in the ways they're responding to these questions. So they'll oftentimes reveal the loss, and then they'll sort of go to this homophobic phrase of no homo, which means even though I desire these friendships, I'm not gay. And that's a very odd thing because that link is not evident when you hear boys when they're younger. They don't think that being close to a friendship is linked to a sexuality, but they do when they get older, and that's what gets in the way. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the stories we learned, this is the 5-part story we learned from boys, and I'm going to then quickly review how it's also evident in the larger body of research, and then we're going to get to the solutions of how do you address the crisis of connection. So that we learned that boys want close same-sex friendships. It's natural. It's natural. It's a human desire. It's not a gender desire or a desire linked to sexuality. It's about being human. Boys want it as well as girls and women and men and non-gender conforming people. Norms of masculinity that privilege the self over relationships, thinking over feeling, independence over interdependence, get in the way of their ability to find and maintain close friendships, particularly close same-sex friendships. The clash between what is the nature of boys and masculine culture leads to a crisis of connection, which by that I mean soaring rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. We see that across all age groups. That's not just teenagers. That's across all age groups. We are seeing soaring rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness epidemic in most countries around the world, industrialized countries around the world. We learn about the crisis of connection has deadly consequences from boys. As boys, right at the moment in which they talk about disconnecting from their close friendships is exactly when the suicide rate rises dramatically for boys and men. The suicide is rising dramatically in boys and men across the world, particularly for late teenagers and middle-aged men. The suicide rates are off the charts. If you look at the data, it's linked to this deep sense of alienation with themselves and with others. Finally, the solution is to change the culture so that it values what humans want and need at home, in school, and in the workplace. And that's what boys teach us. So now I want to very quickly, Marc, just review the exact same story in the larger body of research. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so the human, sorry, go back one slide, 1 second. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I call the body of knowledge, it's the sciences across about 14, 15 disciplines, neuroscience, developmental psychology, social psychology, all sorts of disciplines, tell a story. They tell a story in their findings. It goes across most of the century, the 20th century and into the 21st century. And I'm calling it the Science of Human Connection, a 5-part story. It will be a book soon coming out of Harvard University Press with this title. Next slide, please. Okay, the number one thing we learned from the research, we've learned it all the way back from the 50s and 60s with John Bowlby and attachment theory, is that humans need one another to thrive. That's fundamentally the bottom line, is that we need each other, we need that connection, we need that emotional intimacy with each other to thrive. We have almost a century of research proving that in all sorts of ways. We need it for our mental health, our physical health. We die younger when we don't have it. Our cancer metastasizes more quickly. Our wounds heal more slowly when we don't have connections. There's all sorts of ways that we have empirical evidence that humans need one another to thrive, yet we still, as I'll talk about in a second, live in a culture which we don't prioritize that connection. We also have a fantastic new book that just came out about friendships. Humans want and need friendships to thrive. It is remarkable. Marc and I talk about this all the time. It's remarkable how much we've neglected friendships, especially among adults. We don't think that they're as important as romantic relationships or family relationships. They are definitely equally important, if not more important. Some of the research suggests that actually friendships are more important than spousal relationships in terms of predicting longevity. So friendships are a key part of what we need to thrive, and they're radically undervalued in our culture. So next slide. I'm going to do a few quotes from people that I care about. This is a primatologist, Franz de Waal. He wrote a fantastic book called The Age of Empathy. We involuntarily enter the bodies of those around us so that their movements and emotions echo within us as if they're our own from the very beginning of life. Next slide. We are wired to be social. We are driven by deep motivations to stay connected to friends and families. We are naturally curious about what is going on in the minds of other people. We will spend our entire lives motivated by social connection. And that's Matthew Lieberman. He's a social neuroscientist. Next slide. Okay, the second part of the story. So the first part of the story, just to follow me, it's a 5-part story, the same 5-part story we heard from the boys. First part of the story is we need each other. We want friendships. That's a part of who we are. That's our human nature to want these relationships. We're not just selfish, greedy jerks, as we are oftentimes stereotyped to be as humans. We're actually also deeply social and emotional human beings, as all of you already know. The second part of the story is there's a clash with our culture. We live in a culture that doesn't value the very qualities we need to thrive. So it's a culture that perpetuates dehumanizing stereotypes that are premised on a hierarchy of humanness, men over women, white people over people of color, rich over poor, straight over gay, etc., and values the me over the we, thinking over feeling, and stoicism over vulnerability. And if we live in such a culture that values the me over the we, thinking over feeling, and stoicism over vulnerability, it is incredibly hard to build healthy relationships. So it is the clash between the culture we live in and our human nature that is literally causing the crisis of connection. Because it's very hard to, if we raise our children, this is what I always say to parents, if you raise our children and we teach our children to value the self over relationships, we shouldn't wonder why they have a hard time forming relationships, healthy relationships when they get older. Okay, and there's lots of research that backs up what I'm saying, and I've listed some of them at the bottom. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a neuroscientist. She makes a point that, in fact, you know, the so-called gender difference is actually a cultural phenomenon. It is not a biological phenomenon. We still continue to believe that gender differences are biological around social emotional capacity. It simply isn't. There's more variation among boys or girls or men and women than between them. So infant brains are so malleable that what begin as small differences at birth become amplified over time as parents and teachers and bosses and all sorts of people and the culture at large unwittingly reinforce gender stereotypes. And of course, that's also true with racial stereotypes and all sorts of stereotypes. Next slide. Okay, the third part of the story. So the first part is that we are human, that we need each other. The second part is the clash between nature and culture. The third part is the crisis of connection, the clash leading to a crisis of connection, which I'm defining as a disconnection from the self and to others. So the crisis of connection is not just connection to others, but it's a disconnection from self, which is the idea is that we cannot be connected. This is what I've learned from listening to young people for 30 years. We cannot be connected to other people if we're not connected to ourselves. So we have to think about it, that the connection has to be connection to self as well as connection to others. And there's all sorts of data, and you read about it in the paper every day, about the growing level of distrust, the decline in empathy, the rates of depression and loneliness, et cetera. It's all over the press. I have tons of data on that show that this crisis of connection is really happening in our around the world. Next slide. Okay, the consequences of the crisis, again, I have empirical evidence for that. That's the fourth part of the story, which is that the consequences of this crisis of connection is suicide, violence, substance use, hate crimes, school shootings. I'm writing a book now about school shooters, and it's very, very clear in their manifestos of school shooters that the root of their violence is a deep sense of loneliness, a deep sense of yearning for friendships, not being seen, not feeling heard, and being angry about the fact that nobody seems to care, that nobody seems to want to help them make connection. And you can see where this is leading in terms of solutions. Okay, so this is all these data about the increase in mass shootings. I just have to say, before 1996, we basically had no mass shootings, school shootings. And now we have more than once a day, we have school shooters. So it's definitely a crisis of connection that's become much more intensified over the past 20 years. Okay, next slide. Okay, finally, the fifth part is really the solutions, and I should have put that after part 5. This is really the solution. So if you think of it as a story, a 5-part story, that we start the story that we need each other to thrive, but we live in a culture that clashes with what we want, the obvious solution is to actually begin to try to create a culture, a workplace culture, a home culture, a school culture, all cultures that we live in, into a place which literally and actively works on building connections, building intimacy, building the capacity to be both stoic and vulnerable, building the possibility of genuine, deep, secret friendships, which is what the boys call it, not only with people of your same sex or opposite sex, but people of all sorts of identities. So having those connections across all sorts of identities, including across race and across religion, et cetera. So the way to do that, there's 2 things that I'm going to argue is critical here. So the fundamental is we have to replace judgment with curiosity of other people. We have to be actually curious about other people. We are remarkably incurious about each other. We want to tell our own story, but we don't really want to listen to somebody else's story. So we have to nurture what I'm calling interpersonal curiosity. We have to nurture that in the workplace. We have to nurture that in schools and homes. The idea is that we should be curious about each other, because at the root of all good connection is curiosity. If you're not curious about the person you're trying to form the connection with, you'll never be connected. So the idea of interpersonal curiosity being fundamental to that connection is important. And then you have to listen with not with judgment, but with curiosity. Okay, and then of course I'm gonna say this, value friendships as much as romantic and family relationships. That has to really be one of the very first things we do, is let's make very, very clear that what we've learned from young people, they've been telling us this for many, many decades. They've been trying to shout it from the top of the mountain, that friendships matter throughout the life course, from when you're little to when you're old, to death. Friendships matter, and they are critical for our mental and our physical health. And we have to start seeing that as a core part of our solution to the crisis of connection, is just simply valuing them and then figuring out how to foster them. Okay, next slide. And this is the end. Mark, I'm done. Let me just do one more slide. So the solution is the listening project, which I've been doing for about 6 years now. And we have a big grant now to do it in all sorts of schools around the country, and I do it around the world. I do it and do this project in Ethiopia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Abu Dhabi, and in New York City, and we're trying to expand it in all sorts of ways. And the listening project is basically teaching young people about a method called transformative interviewing, which is a method of listening that allows us to see each other outside of a set of stereotypes, racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, all sorts of things that get in the way of us listening. And also really tries to nurture that interpersonal curiosity, and defines listening. This is critical for me. Defines listening not as sitting passively and listening to someone talk, which oftentimes means you're spacing out, as my students have told me many times, that when they're listening, oftentimes listening is just your mind is wandering about something else, or you're getting ready to be for you to talk and you're not really listening. So listening is actually defined in part active listening as asking follow-up questions, asking open-ended follow-up questions, really trying to understand what someone else is saying, and really nurturing the capacity for follow-up questions. I just have to say, Mark, and I really want to talk about this when we talk, is the extent to which people have a hard time coming up with follow-up questions, which is stunning to me, because it's a natural human capacity to know how to do that. That's curiosity. But we really stamp it out of ourselves. We have it when we're little, as everybody knows who has a 2 or 3 year old. We have that curiosity when we're little, and we just stamp it out as people get older. And by the time we're adults, our interpersonal curiosity has sort of been deadened. So the Listening Project is really about bringing that back and then helping people form deep connections with each other in different contexts, including in the workplace. Okay, Mark, so I can go one more slide to a quote, and then we're turning it over to a conversation. So a quote from James Baldwin, which is a very powerful quote for me. The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter even but a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. So I'm hoping with the data that we have and with the data over the past century, that we begin to see the world differently in terms of how we see ourselves and how we see each other. And then we can really change it and actually create a more connected, just, and humane world. So thank you so much, Mark. That was wonderful to have that opportunity. Mark, I can't hear you. Hold on.
You can't hear me because I was on
I
mute.
can't hear you, Mark.
Now you can, right?
Oh, there we go. There we go. There we go. There we go. Say it again. Say it again. Say it again.
18 months of doing virtual presentations, and I still can't take myself off mute. So, Niobe, I guess my first question is, like, how did we get here? Like, literally, what are your thoughts about?
Yeah.
How did America? How did the other societies get to the place where we are so disconnected? Yeah. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we got lost along the way. This is what I think happened. And I've been writing about this and thinking about it because it's, of course, the question I always get asked. I think we got lost along the way when we, you see it in the data, beginning in the 60s and 70s, there's these incredible research on Google where we look at the language we used in the 60s and 70s. We use the words, the pronouns, we used we and us and a collective words much more in the 60s and 70s than we did in the 80s and 90s. So you see a transition in the 60s and 70s where we were still sort of talking about the collective and the we, even though, of course, the debate was who's in the we, of course, with the civil rights movement and the women's movement. But the idea was that there was an active discussion about the we. Then you get the 80s, where you get Reaganomics, you get this whole sort of sense of building, focusing on wealth attainment. Income inequality starts to grow in the 80s. And we start to become increasingly focused on essentially making money and creating opportunity to make money. And what the data suggests is it was the 80s that we really began to lose our way. I would say we got lost, where we became focused on acquiring wealth, people across the board. And we lost a sense of who we are as humans and our need for deep connection and for community. And I also think, Mark, and I've said this before, and it's a very controversial thing to say, but I want to say it anyway. I think also with women and gay people and people of color becoming in more positions of power and entering the conversations, there was sort of a backlash to that. And then the divide started to get exacerbated. So that as women and gay people and people of color became more prominent, there was a panic about somehow that they're going to get in the way of us being able to acquire wealth or whatever it was that we were seeking. And so partly what you're seeing is a backlash to sort of what we learned from, the softer side of our human nature. So I think there's a way in which from the 80s, you see then the crisis of connection really begin and just get worse and worse and worse. And by the way, Mark, David Brooks from the New York Times has written a lot about this. And a way that he also believes it sort of started from the 80s and then gets worse as we get older. as we get, not I get older, you get older, but as the society moves along. But I think it starts from sort of losing a sense of who we are. And you also see it in the decline of religious activity. Religious activity oftentimes brought us connected to each other. We've become less interested as a culture in religion. Obviously, there's lots of exceptions, but the idea is we become less religious, which means we become less interested in that community life. So that's the best answer I have. And then social media, obviously social media. Social media has exacerbated it by making it, because social media is not social media, Mark, it's me media. It's I'm so pretty, I'm so sexy, I'm so talented. It's not a social media, it's a me media. And it got that way because of the culture we live in. We take selfies, not we-fees, as I always say.
Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate that. I was also thinking, even other kinds of technology, which I read this article a long time ago about how air conditioning actually changed the way we connected in our neighborhoods, because instead of sitting on the porch, after dinner and taking a walk, people stayed inside. So curiosity.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, Mark, that's really important. I want to add to that point, Mark. It's very interesting because you are absolutely spot on, Mark. It is part that we're leaving the home less. We used to be outside more connecting, and we are more in our homes. I really want to underscore that for the audience, because I really think that's such an obvious thing that has changed, and something that is worth underscoring to people. Get out of your house. That's part of the solution. Take walks. Do things outside with other people. I mean, no, really. I mean, that's really like one of the most basic solutions is get out of your house. And interact with other people, make an effort to be social. Anyways, go ahead, Mark. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
So I guess one other, I'm thinking about my own development now. Of course, now it's all about me. Sorry about that. And
it's good. It's good.
I, as a kid, was, like you said, really curious, and I remember having this book at home called The Book of Why. And it was like, because I was always, whenever my parents would, do so, I'd say, why? But what happened is that my questioning led them to get irritated with me. Stop asking so many questions. And I think that when I realized that, and catch me if I'm wrong here, what I'm feeling all of a sudden is this idea that the more questions that I ask, right, the more I'm pulling away from your selfishness, right? Because, the I want my time, it's about me. The more a child, the more a colleague, is curious and asks questions, the more time you have to give up, right, to connect, to support somebody. And I'm just curious, what you think about that.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating because, first of all, remember that the only sort of phrase we have around curiosity is curiosity killed the cat.
Right.
And that's incredible to me that we think curiosity actually killed the cat. You know what I mean? Think about the importance of curiosity for human thriving. And we think that on our only phrase we have around curiosity is curiosity killed the cat. So why? And I think it really is that somehow we think that why we think those questions are irritating is because it is this sense that somehow that distracts us from the task of success or the task of work or the task of focus on serious things rather than sort of lightweight things, which is about who you are, Mark. So, and I think that's what I'm saying about being lost, Mark, is that the fact that we think it's a waste of time to talk to you, Mark, and find out who you are and have you talk to me about who I am, that's fundamentally so problematic. Because the reality is, Mark, you know this research as well as I do. We know that social and emotional well-being is linked to cognitive well-being. Mm-hmm. So you are going to be a more productive worker, a more happy worker, if you're deeply connected to other people in the workplace. And the other thing what I want to bring out, Mark, because this is a very important study that's been replicated many times. So there's been a study at UVA that's been replicated that you basically see the task ahead of you as less difficult if you're standing next to your best friend. If you're next to your best friend, you literally understand the task is less difficult than when you're alone or standing next to a stranger. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that our perception, even of how difficult the task is affected by who's around us. I mean, that's profound. We're so sensitive as human beings. We are literally shaped. I see the math problem or the science, design or the science experiment as less complicated when you're standing next to me, Marc. Like, it's incredible. So our perceptions is shaped by our social emotional well-being. So it is not a waste of time. It is not a waste of time to spend the time getting to know you and you getting to know me and us seeing each other.
Yeah, I mean, what you're making me think about in the last couple of minutes that we have together is like the levels of knowing. And so like when I first met you, I'm like, I can pick up your personality traits, I can pick up extroversion and introversion, and things like that. But like, who cares? Like, traits are not that interesting, really, right? Then there's like, I kind of know what drives you and what you're interested in and what you're motivated about. But the only way to really know someone is to know their story. And the only way you can know their story, right?
Of course.
Is by asking questions and getting to know and listening. And so my last question for you is, why are we so inhibited? Why are we so inhibited? Why are we as a society, what makes us so inhibited?
Okay, I'll tell you, I'll give you a very simple answer because simplicity is always helpful. It's simply that when we don't feel listened to, we are not motivated to listen to other people because we take the scarcity model. This is our moment to share our story because nobody else is going to ask it. So the idea is we have to shift the story, and 80% of American people apparently report that they don't feel listened to. It's from various different studies, but most of us don't feel listened to. So if we're not feeling listened to, we're not going to listen to other people. So we have to change the whole story to say, if we premise our workspace, our school space, our home space on actually nurturing interpersonal curiosity in different ways, getting us to ask each other questions. Because remember, you don't want to share your story, Marc, if I don't seem interested, right? Like if I'm not really listening and I'm not really asking you questions, you don't want to share it. You only want to share it when I ask questions of you, because then I'm showing that I'm interested. So if we begin to really listen to each other, what's going to happen is we're going to feel less panicked when we get to tell our story, that it's not going to, this is the only moment I get to share my story. And so it's the idea that we have to understand, if we don't feel listened to, if we don't feel seen, if we don't feel heard, we are totally in a defensive, oftentimes depressed state. So it's very hard to listen in that state. So we have to nurture the self so that they feel, like that there'll be other opportunities. But I think most importantly is we have to really nurture that interpersonal curiosity that allows you, Marc, to be seen by me, and then you can see me, and vice versa. Does that answer the question?
It does. And unfortunately, we're out of time. Somebody was saying earlier that they just preferred to have you as the speaker for the whole day, but I don't want to feed your narcissism too much. Niobe, thank you so much for being part of the conference. Really.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, good. Okay, thank you, everybody.
We'll make sure everybody's access
to Marc, if you could share my email. And share my email, because I'd love, if people have questions or something, go ahead and share my email. Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you, Niobe.